All right, guys, we are back for section 5, which is all about digital piracy. So here's our funny internet picture of the day. That isn't me, but it could have been me when I was a teenager. Like, I did not want to leave my house. Teaching this same class, actually, one time a student came up to me and says, "Dr. Jennings, how did you learn all this stuff about computers?" I just looked at her and I said, "You remember dating in high school?" She said, "Yeah." I said, "I don't." I was very much the nerd's nerd, and just stayed at home on my computer all day. So yeah. Anyway, so piracy, software piracy has been a thing for a long time, but music piracy kind of really became a thing in the late 90s with the invention of the MP3 file format, and so music sales dropped 20% from 98 to 2002, and then another like 30% between that and 2010. So legal music sales have been dropping like a rock since the late 90s. On the other hand, concert sales have gone way, way up in that same time. There's an estimate that only about 1/3 of all digital music is paid for, which is a very, very, very low number. And then 1/4 of all internet traffic is piracy, whether it's movie piracy, music piracy, etc. On the other hand, these numbers all come from the industry itself, which has a vested interest in making the problem seem larger than it is. So, should we believe those numbers? It's up to you. But they should be taken with a grain of salt, because again, these are numbers coming from organizations that have a vested legal interest in making the problem seem like a big deal. Intellectual property. It is people have the right to own and distribute their artwork, essentially. Just because you put something down in a reproducible format doesn't mean you no longer retain the legal ability to control how it's produced and distributed and all these things. So copyright has been part of the law for centuries. If somebody writes a book, you're not allowed to legally copy that book and start selling copies yourself, right? And there's different kinds of intellectual property. There's copyrights, which is usually for things like written words. There's trademarks for things like brand names, and there's patents for things like inventions. But they're all essentially legal protections for ideas, for words, for images, for all the different things that are theoretically reproducible, right? And each of these has certain legal protections. So for instance, with copyright, any work you create in the United States is copyrighted. If I wrote a book right now, it would be copyrighted, and I would have, as the author, the sole ability to determine its reproduction and distribution and all those things, thanks to existing copyright law. Same thing with music and movies and books and television shows and software and all those things that people create and are essentially just, when you get right down to it, they're just essentially sequences of ones and zeros. But that particular sequence of ones and zeros is protected via these laws. Okay? Now, as I said earlier, pirating has been a thing since basically forever. You can go back to long before anybody seeing this was born, and people were pirating sheet music, right? In the 19th century, one person would buy the sheet music to some, piece of piano music and copy it by hand and give it out to their friends. You get up into the 70s and 80s, and people are using audio tapes to pirate. They're either, buying, the latest, Lynyrd Skynyrd or Pink Floyd cassette, then they buy a blank cassette, and they copy the one onto the other. Or they would, say, record off of the radio, right? They would have the radio playing, and when a song came on that they liked, they would hit record. That song would go onto the audio tape, and then they would have essentially pirated that music. The CDs, when CDs first came out, you could copy those, although that was a little bit harder to do because it took some special hardware that most people didn't have. A regular CD player couldn't write CDs. But pirates, especially like in the Asian countries, would have these CD duplicating machines, and they would buy one copy of the latest CD, roll off 1,000 copies, and then sell those to either people in their country or tourists or whatever. I actually did a lot of traveling around Asia when I was a kid in the 80s, and you could buy pirated anything on the street there. I mean, they had stalls set up with pirated movies and music and all this stuff. But piracy really became a thing, especially with music, when MP3s came out. So as I said earlier, late 90s, the MP3 file format is created, which the file format was absolutely revolutionary because you were able to make really, really high quality music in a very, very small digital format. So prior to MP3s, you could get the really high quality music in digital format, but the files were huge. So on the old internet, it would take you hours and hours and hours and hours to download them. And with the size of the hard drives back then, you could only store a few of them on your hard drive before it filled the whole thing. So it really wasn't feasible to have large volumes of good quality music on a hard drive and share it over the internet. But with MP3s, now you would get CD quality music, and it was only 3 or 4 megabytes per song, which meant you could store hundreds of them or thousands of them on a hard drive. And so finally, with that, it became the impetus for a huge explosion in digital music piracy, especially. Originally, these things were traded around. Songs were traded via digital communities like forums, news groups, IRC chat. For those of you who don't know IRC chat, it's still going. You can still get on IRC chat rooms today. They're not very popular anymore because it's usually only the old school people that have been there for decades that are still on there. But they're free. You can connect to all these different IRC chat rooms. But there was a lot of sharing and trading going on in these chat rooms and news groups and forums and stuff. And it was basically like, hey, I've got this song, you've got that song, I'll send you a copy of mine, you send me a copy of yours, and they would trade files like that. Then there was this giant company called Napster, and Napster was huge. Everybody had Napster. And essentially what you did was you just downloaded this program on your computer. Then when you ran it, you would see all the different songs available from all the other Napster users that were online. And you could download from them, and it would take, if I downloaded this song and 5 different people had it, all 5 would send me pieces of that song, and I would slowly download a piece of it from each of the 5. And other people would be downloading from me, and it was this giant community of sharing all this music. And you could get dang near anything on Napster. This really, really, really upset the music industry. And it was a famous lawsuit by Lars Ulrich from Metallica, sued Napster, and got the whole company taken down. And because Napster stored all this information about all these different songs on their own servers, right? So Napster got shut down. Now, this created a vacuum to where people now, they still wanted to pirate this music. So other companies like Kazaa and LimeWire, and there were a few other ones, they sprang up, and they fixed the mistake that Napster made. Now, none of the Kazaa servers, none of the LimeWire servers had any of that information on it. It was entirely peer-to-peer, right? So you would use Kazaa or LimeWire as a meeting place, but the only data that contained illegal information went from person to person. It wasn't stored on any central server. Thus, they couldn't be taken down legally in the same way that Napster was. So people started trading music using these services. But today, the biggest thing is what's called BitTorrent. BitTorrent works essentially the same way as Napster did, where you connect with other individual users. People who upload material they already have are called seeders. People who download that material from others are called leechers. And it's a constantly going back and forth process. So let's say I download Star Wars, right? I am downloading, if there's 100 people seeding that movie, I will take a little bit from each of the 100 and slowly download that movie onto my hard drive. As I'm downloading it, the pieces that I have already finished downloading, I am now a seeder for. So other people are downloading it from me. And it's a constantly shifting spread of information. Once I get 100% of the pieces for that movie, now I'm done. I can either continue to seed it, or I can stop seeding it and not allow anybody else to download it from me. But that's essentially how BitTorrent works. You have to find torrent links from somewhere. And the most popular place is a website called the Pirate Bay. The Pirate Bay was originally hosted in Sweden, and it basically is a giant conglomeration where people can say, hey, here's all the stuff that I have, and you can go there, find stuff, and download it, and it'll tell you how many seeders there are, how many, when it was uploaded, what the file name is. It allows users to comment on each file, and obviously this really upset a lot of music groups and movie groups and television groups. And so they keep trying to take down the Pirate Bay. And every time they take it down, it comes up in another country or in another area within hours, right? It's like that whack-a-mole game at the fair, where every time they try to take down the Pirate Bay, it just keeps popping up somewhere else. And so every couple months, they'll successfully take down one version of the Pirate Bay, but within hours, it'll be back working somewhere else. So it is a very, very popular place to find this pirated, everything from the latest movies to television shows to ebooks to, whatever you want to pirate, you can find through the Pirate Bay. So, two ways that companies have dealt with this piracy. And this is one of my favorite pictures on the internet, because this is little old ladies at a bookstore pirating recipes. So they have these cookbooks, and they're copying by hand the recipes out of these books, which is essentially little old ladies pirating recipes, which is absolutely hilarious to me. But companies have tried to do different things to stop piracy. One of the first things they did was digital rights management, which is essentially an electronic way to try to assure that the version of the software you're using is legit. And there's lots of different ways to do digital rights management. One of the first ways I remember was with old video games. We're talking late 80s into the early 90s here. You would start playing a game, and with the 5 minutes after you started playing, it would say, hey, what is the fourth word in the top paragraph on page 96 of the instruction manual for this game? And you had to find the instruction manual for the game, turn to page 96, find the word they were talking about, and type it in. This was trying to prevent people from just copying the game and sharing it around. And the thinking was, only if you had a legitimate copy of the game would you have a copy of the manual and be able to figure out what the right passphrase was. A lot of people just Xeroxed the instruction manual then. And of course today, when you can get a digital copy of an instruction manual just as easy as you can get a digital copy of the game, that doesn't work anymore. But other ways to do digital rights management are, using some kind of like encryption system or some kind of, video games in the 90s, they would check to see whether a physical disc was in the drive, and the discs were labeled in a way that if you just copied the CD, it wouldn't copy that particular part of the CD that it was looking for, right? So if I had a legitimate copy of StarCraft, that was a huge game back in the late 90s. If I had a legit copy of StarCraft, I could make a copy of the CD, and I could install the game using that copy. But when I tried to play the game, the software that I installed would say, hey, I'm going to look in the CD drive and see if there's a current copy of the StarCraft commercial CD in there. And it would recognize the commercial version, but on the copy, it didn't have whatever piece that the software was looking for. And it would say, hey, I can't play this game unless you have that commercial CD in the drive. But then people found a way around that. And essentially, this digital rights management, people who wanted to pirate found ways around this very quickly. Any kind of system that is designed by humans to protect from piracy is going to be broken by other humans almost as fast as it comes out. There was some game company a few years ago that said, we're going to have this great digital rights management, and it was cracked within hours of the game coming out. It is basically impossible to create a digital rights management that will prevent people from pirating that software or music or movie or whatever. The downside is it upsets legitimate owners of that software, because it's always, no matter what kind of digital rights management you're talking about, if you legally own that piece of software, that digital rights management is going to annoy you as a legitimate user. So in essence, when the companies were doing this, they were annoying their legitimate consumers while not really preventing people from pirating it, but it made piracy seem more attractive, because once they had cracked the digital rights management, you didn't have that annoying part on there anymore, right? So a lot of people, even if they owned a legitimate copy, they would download a pirated version just because it didn't have that DRM that annoyed the heck out of them. Does that make sense? So these days, one of the things they're doing is they're streaming. They're making owning a legitimate copy or using a legitimate copy as easy as possible. They're taking away all barriers to owning and using this. So like for music, we have stations like Pandora and Spotify and things like this where you can stream music and it's legal and it's either free or very cheap, and the companies are allowed to have that protection of their intellectual property, and pirating that music or in the case of YouTube, TV shows or some kind of visual medium or whatever, they're making it so easy that there's really no need to pirate, and making it so that, people have access legitimately to it, and it's easy and available and cheap. Does that make sense? All right. We're going to come back in a bit and talk about the people who do the pirating, because it still does exist.